She was going to sell herself into slavery, not for money, not for power, but for a single piece of bread for her dying son. The sun was a merciless god in the Wyoming sky, a boiling copper eye that offered no shade and no pity. It baked the very air she breathed, turning it to dust in her lungs. Margaret Sawyer didn't feel the heat anymore. She didn't feel much of anything except the terrifyingly light weight of the child in her arms. Little Thomas, her boy. His ribs felt like a birdcage under his threadbare shirt. His breath was a tiny, shallow puff against her neck, a sound so faint it terrified her more than his screams ever had. The screams had stopped hours ago, maybe even a day. Time had melted into a single, agonizing moment of putting one cracked boot in front of the other. 3 days. 3 days since they had eaten anything but a few bitter roots that tasted of dirt and despair. 3 days since the last homesteader had looked at her son's fever-bright eyes, then at her widow's dress, and slammed the door in her face. A widow brought bad luck. A widow with a sick child was a curse made flesh. The whispers had followed her like vultures. Her husband, dead in a mine collapse. Her family, a distant memory back east. Her skills, keeping a home that no longer existed. She was useless, a burden. She knew it. The whole world had made it painfully clear. And then she saw it. A dark smudge on the horizon. A smudge that slowly, miraculously resolved itself into a cabin, a lean-to, a small corral, and smoke. A thin, hopeful ribbon of smoke rising from a stone chimney. Someone was home. Hope was a dangerous thing. It hurt more than the hunger. But her feet moved faster anyway, stumbling over the cracked earth, kicking up dust that settled on Thomas's pale face like a shroud. As she got closer, the place felt still. Too still. No dogs barked a warning. No children played in the yard. Just the whisper of the wind through grass that was the color of old bones. She stopped at the edge of the property, swaying, the world tilting around her. "Hello?" Her voice was a dry rasp, a stranger's voice. She tried again, louder. "Hello? Is anyone home?" A man emerged from the barn. He moved with a quiet purpose, carrying a heavy saddle as if it were nothing. He was tall, broad, a silhouette of hard labor and solitude against the dying sun. He set the saddle on the corral fence, then just stood there watching her. His face was hidden in the shadow of a worn hat, but she could feel his eyes on her, assessing, judging. This was it. The last house. The last chance. Pride was a luxury for women with full bellies and healthy children. Margaret had none. She sank to her knees in the dust, clutching Thomas so tightly he let out a weak whimper. The words spilled out of her, raw and broken, born from a place beyond desperation. "Please, sir," she began, the prayer she'd rehearsed in her head 100 times. "I'll work. I'll do anything. Cooking, cleaning, tending your animals. I don't need wages. I don't need a bed. Just a little food for my boy. Some shelter." He didn't move. The silence stretched, thick and heavy as the heat. "I'll be your servant," she said, the words tasting like ash. "Your slave. I'll sign papers. I'll do whatever you want. You'll never even have to see me. I can work at night. I can sleep in the barn. Just please." Her voice finally broke, shattering into 1,000 pieces of pain. "He's dying. My boy is dying. And I can't watch it happen. Please don't let my baby die." The man remained motionless, a statue carved from prairie dust and silence. Margaret felt the last flicker of hope extinguish inside her. She had offered the only thing she had left, her freedom, her very self. And it wasn't enough. It was never enough. She tried to push herself up, to walk away, to spare herself the final humiliation of him ordering her off his land. But her legs were gone. The world went gray at the edges. "Stay there." The voice was low, rough, like rocks grinding together. It wasn't kind, but it wasn't cruel. It was just a command. Her head snapped up. He had moved closer, silent as a ghost. In the fading light she could see his face, weathered, lined with a sorrow that looked older than the man himself. He turned and walked toward the cabin. He wasn't reaching for a gun. He just walked to the door, held it open, and looked back at her over his shoulder. "You wanted shelter," he said, his voice flat. "Get inside." She scrambled to her feet, her legs shaking uncontrollably. He made no move to help, just held the door, waiting. She stumbled past him into the single, sparse room. It was clean, orderly, the home of a man who lived with ghosts and preferred their company to anyone else's. "Set the boy by the hearth," he said. She laid Thomas down on a pile of blankets, her hands lingering on his hot skin. She watched as the man, this stranger, bolted the heavy wooden bar across the door. The sound echoed in the small cabin like a jail cell door slamming shut. He turned to face her, his eyes unreadable in the lamplight he'd just lit. And Margaret Sawyer realized her prayer had been answered. She had found shelter. She had found a master. But as the heavy bar settled into place, a new cold terror gripped her. She hadn't just found shelter from the prairie. She had walked herself and her dying son into a cage. Panic seized her, cold and sharp. What had she done? She'd begged a stranger for help, and he'd locked them in. He moved around the small cabin with a grim efficiency that was terrifying. He wasn't looking at her. He wasn't speaking. He was just moving, his silence a crushing weight. "Sir?" she tried, her voice trembling. "The door." He ignored her. He stoked the embers in the fireplace, adding wood until a small fire crackled to life. He filled a pot with water from a bucket by the door. His every movement was precise, deliberate, and utterly devoid of emotion. Margaret's mind raced. Had she stumbled into the home of a madman? A monster who preyed on desperate women? The stories she'd heard at lonely campfires suddenly felt chillingly real. He was a big man, strong. She wouldn't stand a chance. And Thomas, oh God, Thomas. What had she led her son into? "Please," she whispered, backing away until her shoulders hit the rough log wall. "My boy is sick. We don't have anything worth taking." For the first time he looked at her. His eyes were the color of a winter sky, tired and haunted. "Be quiet," he said. It wasn't a shout. It was a simple, flat command that allowed no argument. "You'll scare the boy." He knelt beside Thomas, his large, calloused hand surprisingly gentle as he felt the child's forehead. Thomas whimpered, and the man pulled his hand back as if he'd been burned. He stood up and went to a cupboard, pulling out dried herbs that filled the cabin with a sharp, medicinal smell. He mixed them into a cup of warm water, his back to her the entire time. Margaret's fear was a living thing, clawing at her throat. She had to get them out. She glanced at the windows, shuttered and barred from the inside. She looked at the door, at the heavy wooden beam he'd slid into place. There was no escape. And then she heard it. Hoofbeats. A group of riders moving fast. They weren't slowing down. They thundered past the cabin without pausing, their voices rough and their laughter ugly on the night air. They were hunters, and Margaret knew, with a sudden, gut-wrenching certainty, that she and Thomas had been the prey. The man, Ethan, waited until the sound of the hoofbeats faded completely into the distance. Only then did he walk to the door and lift the heavy bar. The sound of it being removed was as loud as the sound of it being locked. He didn't open the door. He just turned back to her, the same unreadable expression on his face. "They're gone now," he said. The realization hit her like a physical blow. He hadn't locked them in. He had locked the danger out. He hadn't been ignoring her pleas. He had been focused on a threat she couldn't even see. He hadn't trapped them. He had saved them. Who were they?" she stammered. "Doesn't matter," he said, turning his attention back to the cup in his hand. "They're the kind of men who see a woman and a child alone on the prairie and don't see people. They see sport." He brought the cup over. "Help me sit him up. He needs to drink this." She knelt beside him, her hands shaking for an entirely different reason now. Together, they propped Thomas up. She watched as this silent, grim man coaxed the bitter tea past her son's lips. His touch careful, his movements sure. He wasn't a monster. He was a protector. But the way he'd reacted, the fortifications on his cabin, the haunted look in his eyes, it told her that the men who rode in the night were not a random threat. They were a familiar one. She had escaped the prairie only to find herself on the edge of a private war, and she and her son were standing squarely in the middle of it. "You need to eat," he said, his voice still flat, after they laid Thomas back down. "Can't help the boy if you collapse." He moved to the stove and began preparing food. Simple fare, stew from a pot that had been simmering, thick slices of bread. He placed it on the table in front of her. I, I don't understand," she said. "You saved us." "Boy was sick," he grunted, not looking at her. "You were half dead, that's all." But it wasn't all. She knew it. The fear she'd seen in his eyes when he checked on Thomas. The grim set of his jaw as the riders passed. This went deeper than simple kindness. He was hiding something. He was fighting something. And by taking them in, he had just dragged them into the fight with him. "What is this place?" she asked. "Who are you?" He finally turned, his gaze heavy. "My name is Ethan Brooks, and this place—" He looked around the small, sparse cabin as if seeing a ghost in every corner. "This place is the last thing I have left to lose." He offered them the lean-to off the back of the main cabin. It was little more than a shed, with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a single small window. But to Margaret, it was a palace. It had 4 walls and a door that locked from the inside. It was safety. "It's not much," Ethan said, standing in the doorway, careful not to step inside. It was Mary's. The name hung in the air between them, the first piece of his past he'd offered freely. "Your wife?" she asked softly. He just nodded, his jaw tight. "There are some of her things in the chest. Clothes. They might fit you better than what you have on." He turned to leave, then paused. "Don't go wandering off. Stick close to the cabin. It's safer." The warning was clear. The horsemen from the night before were not a one-time threat. Inside the lean-to, the air was thick with the scent of dried lavender and disuse. It was a woman's space, frozen in time. Margaret opened the small wooden chest at the foot of the bed. Inside were simple, neatly folded dresses, practical clothes for a frontier life. As she lifted one out, a soft blue calico, worn but well cared for, her fingers brushed against something hard tucked into the pocket. She pulled it out, a single tarnished silver button, intricately carved with the shape of a hawk. It was fine work, too fancy for a simple rancher like Ethan. It didn't match any of the clothes in the chest. It felt important, a secret. She didn't know why, but she slipped it into the pocket of her own ragged dress. A mystery to hold on to. The days that followed fell into a strange, quiet rhythm. Margaret worked from sunup to sundown, determined to earn their keep. She cooked, she cleaned, she mended, she resurrected the neglected garden plot behind the cabin. With every weed she pulled, she felt like she was pulling the desperation out of her own soul. Thomas began to heal. The fever broke, and color returned to his cheeks. He was still weak, but the light was back in his eyes. He was fascinated by Ethan. He followed the silent man around the corral, a small, chattering shadow. To Margaret's astonishment, Ethan was patient with him. He answered the boy's endless questions with short, gruff sentences. He showed him how to brush down a horse, how to check a hoof for stones. She would watch them from the garden, a strange ache in her chest. This was the life she had wanted for her son, a father to guide him, a home. Ethan remained a mystery. He spoke little, and never of his wife, Mary. But Margaret could feel her presence everywhere. In the neatly tended rosebush by the door, now struggling for life. In the way Ethan's eyes would sometimes drift to the horizon, his face a mask of old settled grief. One afternoon, about a week after they'd arrived, another rider appeared. This one was different from the night hunters. He rode a fine black horse and wore clothes that spoke of money and influence. He was handsome, with a charming smile that didn't reach his cold, assessing eyes. "Brooks!" he called out, dismounting without invitation. "Heard you had some new company." Ethan came out of the barn, his body instantly tense. He positioned himself between the stranger and the cabin, a silent shield. "Garrison," Ethan said, his voice flat and hard. "You're not welcome here. Now is that any way to greet a neighbor?" Garrison's eyes swept over the property, finally landing on Margaret, who had stilled in the garden. His smile widened. "Well now, I see you finally took my advice. A man shouldn't be alone out here. It's not healthy. Leads to dark thoughts. The words were light, but the insinuation was heavy. He was taunting Ethan. "This is Mrs. Sawyer," Ethan said, his voice dangerously low. "Her and her boy are working for me." "Working for you," Garrison repeated, letting his gaze linger on Margaret in a way that made her skin crawl. "Is that what we're calling it these days?" He took a step closer. "You know, Brooks, my offer still stands. This place is too much for one man. Too many memories. I'd be doing you a favor, taking it off your hands." "The answer's the same as it's always been," Ethan bit out. "Not for sale." "A stubborn man," Garrison said, shaking his head in mock sadness. "But things change. A man with new responsibilities. He might start thinking differently. A woman and a child, they have needs. And accidents happen out here on the prairie. Fences break. Wells go foul. Fires start from nothing." The threat was unmistakable. Garrison tipped his hat to Margaret. "A pleasure, Mrs. Sawyer. I have a feeling we'll be seeing a lot more of each other." He mounted his horse and rode away, leaving a thick, poisonous silence behind him. "Who is he?" Margaret asked, her heart hammering against her ribs. "Trouble," Ethan said, his eyes still fixed on the dust cloud where Garrison had disappeared. "He wants this land. He says it's for the water rights, but it's more than that." "What do you mean?" Ethan turned to look at her, and the grief on his face was so raw it stole her breath. "He wanted Mary," Ethan said, his voice barely a whisper. "And he's never forgiven me for having her." And in that moment, Margaret understood. This wasn't a dispute over land. It was a war over a ghost, and Garrison wouldn't stop until he had destroyed everything that reminded him of the woman he couldn't have, starting with the man she had loved. The threat Garrison left hanging in the air changed everything. The quiet solitude of the ranch was gone, replaced by a tense, watchful waiting. Margaret found herself scanning the horizon constantly, her ears straining for the sound of hoofbeats. Ethan grew even more withdrawn, his silence now laced with a simmering anger that felt like a coiled snake. He began to teach her to shoot. "You need to know how," he said one evening, pressing a heavy rifle into her hands. His tone left no room for argument. "I can't be everywhere at once." His hands covered hers, showing her how to hold it, how to sight down the long barrel. He stood close behind her, his breath warm against her ear. The contact was impersonal, instructional, yet it sent a shiver through her. He was teaching her to kill. He was preparing her for a war he never asked for but couldn't escape. Her first shots were wild, the kick of the rifle bruising her shoulder. But she didn't complain. She just reloaded and tried again, channeling her fear into a cold, hard focus. She would not be a victim. She had been a victim her entire life since her husband died. Not anymore. As she practiced, she grew more unsettled by the secrets of the ranch. One day, while clearing out the old ashes in the main cabin's fireplace to start fresh, her fingers found a piece of paper that had escaped the flames. It was charred around the edges, the handwriting feminine and elegant. "Garrison was here again today. He will not leave me be. He frightens me, Ethan. He speaks of the future as if it belongs to him, as if I belong to him. He says you are not strong enough to protect what is yours." The rest was burned away. Margaret stared at the fragment, her blood running cold. This was Mary's handwriting. This was her fear, reaching out from the past. "Fires start from nothing," Garrison had said. The phrase echoed in her mind. Had the fire that burned this letter been an accident? She confronted Ethan that night, the scorched piece of paper in her trembling hand. "What is this?" He looked at the note, and his face seemed to crumble. He sank into a chair, the strong, silent man suddenly looking broken. "He wouldn't leave her alone," Ethan said, his voice thick with a grief so profound it was suffocating. "He courted her before we were married. She chose me. He never accepted it. He saw her as a prize he'd lost, not a woman who'd made a choice." He looked up at her, his eyes hollow. "He started coming around, making threats. I told him to stay away. One night, I came back from town. The barn was on fire. Not the whole thing, just a section of it. Mary was inside, trying to get the horses out. She was terrified. She said Garrison had been there, that he'd tried to drag her away with him, telling her he was rescuing her from this life. She fought him off, and he set the fire out of spite as he left. "My God," Margaret whispered. "She breathed in too much smoke," Ethan continued, his voice cracking. "The doctor said it weakened her lungs. When the fever came that winter, she couldn't fight it. He killed her, Margaret, as surely as if he'd put a gun to her head." Now she understood the rebuilt section of the barn. Now she understood the haunted look in Ethan's eyes. He wasn't just grieving a wife lost to sickness. He was grieving a wife he believed was murdered. "Why isn't he in jail?" she demanded, her voice rising with outrage. Ethan let out a bitter laugh. "His word against mine. He has money, influence. His cousin is the sheriff. I'm just a homesteader with a dead wife and a story no one wants to believe. They called it an accident, all of them. The injustice of it was a physical blow. The world she'd thought was merely cruel was rotten to its core." A few days later, Garrison returned. This time he caught her alone near the creek where she was washing clothes. Thomas was napping back at the cabin. "We need to talk," Garrison said, dismounting and blocking her path. His charming smile was gone, replaced by a predatory intensity. "We have nothing to talk about," she said, her hand instinctively going to the small pistol Ethan had insisted she carry, hidden in her apron pocket. "Oh, but we do," he said, stepping closer. "You're a smart woman, Margaret. Too smart to tie your future to a broken-down man on a failing ranch, especially a man with a dark past. I know what you did to Mary," she spat, her fear battling with her rage. Garrison actually laughed, a cold, chilling sound. "You know what he told you. Did he tell you how jealous he was? How he couldn't stand the thought of her even speaking to another man? Did he tell you about his temper?" He reached into his waistcoat pocket. "He spun you a good story, but stories aren't proof." He opened his hand. Lying on his palm was a silver button, intricately carved with the shape of a hawk. It was identical to the one she'd found in Mary's dress. "This was Mary's," Garrison said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "She gave it to me. A token. She was going to leave him for me. She was trapped, and I was going to save her. He found out. In a jealous rage, he set the fire himself to stop her from leaving. He killed his own wife because he couldn't stand to see her happy." Margaret stared at the button, then thought of the one she had hidden away. It was a perfect match. Her world tilted on its axis. Ethan's story, Garrison's story. They were twisted mirror images of each other. Both men claimed the other was a monster. Both men had a piece of the puzzle, the fire, Mary's fear, but only one of them was telling the truth. Garrison saw the confusion on her face and pressed his advantage. "He's a killer, Margaret, and he's fooling you just like he fooled everyone else. You and that boy of yours aren't safe with him. Leave with me. I'll give you everything he can't. Protection, a future." His words were a poisoned arrow, finding the tiny seed of doubt that had been planted by Ethan's silence and secrets. She looked at Garrison's handsome, earnest face, then thought of Ethan's haunted, broken one. One of them was a murderer, and she was living under his roof. The world had become a nightmare of whispers and shadows. Margaret felt like she was drowning. Every time she looked at Ethan, she saw two men, the kind, patient protector who was teaching her son to be a man, and the jealous, violent killer from Garrison's story. The matching silver buttons were a terrible, damning piece of evidence. Why would Mary have one and Garrison the other, unless there was a connection between them? Ethan's story didn't explain that. Her hands shook as she worked in the garden. Her nights were sleepless. Thomas, oblivious, was happier than he'd ever been. He adored Ethan. He called him Mr. E, and chattered endlessly about the things they'd done that day. Every laugh from her son was another twist of the knife in her heart. If Garrison was right, she was letting her child bond with his mother's killer. She had to know the truth. That night, after Thomas was asleep, she confronted Ethan. She laid both silver buttons on the rough wooden table, one tarnished from its time in a dead woman's pocket, the other polished from a rich man's waistcoat. "Garrison told me a different story," she said, her voice strained. "He said Mary was leaving you for him. He said you set the fire. He said this was a token she gave him." Ethan stared at the buttons, his face unreadable. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. She wanted him to rage, to deny it, to give her something, anything to hold on to. But he just stood there. His expression shuddered. "What I told you was the truth," he said finally, his voice flat. "Then explain the buttons," she cried, the dam of her control finally breaking. "Why did they both have one? Why didn't you tell me? Ethan, I need to know. I have to protect my son." He looked at her, and the pain in his eyes was so immense, it was like looking into an abyss. "You think I could hurt a woman? You think I could hurt Mary?" "I don't know what to think," she sobbed. "I'm scared, and your silence is making it worse." He ran a hand through his hair, turning away from her. "There are things a man doesn't speak of, pains you wall off or they eat you alive." He finally turned back, his face a mask of weary resignation. "It's not safe for you here anymore. I should have seen that from the start. I was selfish keeping you here, because it was nice, hearing laughter in the house again." He took a deep breath. "In the morning, I'll hitch the wagon. I'll give you enough money to get to the next territory, to start over. You and the boy will be safer far away from me and far away from Garrison." It wasn't a denial. It was a dismissal. He was pushing her away, and in her terrified, confused mind, it was the closest thing to a confession she could imagine. He was sending her away to protect her, not from Garrison, but from himself. Her heart shattered. She had allowed herself to hope, to feel something for this man. She had pictured a future, and it had all been a lie, built on the grave of a murdered woman. Numb with grief and horror, she went to the lean-to to pack their few belongings. She was a fool, a desperate, lonely fool who had trusted the wrong man. As she pulled her old ragged dress from a hook, her hand brushed against the pocket. The button was still there. She pulled it out, ready to throw it into the darkness, to discard the last piece of this cursed place. But as she held it up to the moonlight filtering through the small window, her eyes caught something she'd never noticed before. A tiny inscription, almost worn away on the metal loop at the back. It wasn't a maker's mark. It was a date. With trembling fingers, she lit a lamp and held the button close. The date was clear. It was from the year before, long after Mary had died. It wasn't Mary's button. It couldn't have been. Garrison had lied. But why? And what did it mean? Her mind raced, trying to piece it together. The button in her possession was old, tarnished. The one Garrison had was new. What if Mary's button, the original, had been lost in the fire? What if Garrison, in his obsession, had one made to match it as a replacement? It was a crazy idea, but her eyes fell upon the loose floorboard near the bed, the one that had always creaked when she stepped on it. Ethan had said this was Mary's room, a place for her things. Driven by a sudden, desperate hunch, Margaret knelt and worked her fingers into the crack, prying the board up. Underneath, covered in dust, was a small, leather-bound book. Mary's diary. Her hands shaking so badly she could barely turn the pages, Margaret began to read. The early entries were full of love for Ethan, of plans for their future, for the children they would have. Then the entries began to change. Garrison's name appeared more and more frequently. October 12th. Vincent Garrison stopped by again today. He frightens me. The way he looks at me as if I am a possession he has misplaced. He brought me a gift, a silver button for my coat to replace the one I lost. He said it was identical. How could he know? It was my secret gift to Ethan, a matching button for his favorite coat. I never told anyone. He must have been watching me, watching us. Margaret's heart stopped. A matching button. Not for Mary and Garrison, for Mary and Ethan. Garrison hadn't been her lover. He had been her stalker. She read on, her horror growing with every word. The diary detailed Garrison's escalating obsession, his threats, his refusal to accept her marriage. And then, the final entry, dated the day of the fire. November 4th, he came while Ethan was in town. He was mad. He said he was taking me away. I fought him, and he hit me. He said if he couldn't have me, no one could. He lit the torch. I screamed and he ran. Ethan, my love, I'm so afraid. The smoke is everywhere. The truth in all its devastating clarity hit Margaret like a tidal wave. Ethan wasn't the monster. He was the hero. He had been telling the truth all along, omitting only the part about the button, a detail too painful, a secret gift from his dead wife he couldn't bear to share. Garrison was the monster, a murderer who had twisted his crime into a weapon to torment the man whose life he had destroyed. And she had believed the monster. She had doubted the one man who had shown her true kindness. Before she could even process the shame and relief, before she could run to Ethan and beg for his forgiveness, she heard it, a sound that made the hair on her arms stand up. It wasn't hoofbeats this time. It was the soft, stealthy sound of men on foot surrounding the cabin. And then, a smell. Smoke. Garrison hadn't been content to drive them off. He had come back to finish the job. He had come to burn them all alive. The world erupted in fire and chaos. A torch arced through the night, crashing through the main cabin's window. Flames licked up the dry curtains in an instant. The soft glow of the lamp was swallowed by a hungry, roaring orange. "Ethan!" Margaret screamed, bursting out of the lean-to, the diary clutched in her hand. He was already moving, kicking open the cabin door, a silhouette against the inferno. "Margaret! The well! Get Thomas to the well!" Men materialized from the darkness, their faces hidden by bandanas, their eyes glinting in the firelight. They weren't ranchers. They were hired guns, killers. This wasn't a threat. It was an execution. Margaret ran, not for the well, but for the cabin. Thomas was inside. A man grabbed her arm, spinning her around. His breath was foul, his grip like iron. "The boss wants you alive," he snarled. The rifle training kicked in. She didn't think. She reacted. She brought her knee up hard, rammed the heavy diary into his throat, and clawed at his eyes. He staggered back with a cry of pain and surprise, and she scrambled past him, diving through the doorway into the smoke-filled cabin. "Thomas!" she shrieked, her voice swallowed by the roar of the fire. The room was an oven. She dropped to the floor, crawling under the thickest of the smoke. "Mama!" His voice was a terrified whimper from the corner. He was huddled under the table, his small body shaking. "Come on, baby, we have to go." She grabbed him, pulling him along as she crawled toward the back door. Outside, the night was alive with shouts and the crack of rifle fire. Ethan was out there, fighting them alone, fighting a dozen men to give her and Thomas a chance. The back door splintered open before they could reach it. A figure stood there, blocking their escape. Garrison. His face was demonic in the flickering firelight. His charming mask burned away to reveal the monster beneath. "I told you I'd protect you," he said, his voice eerily calm amidst the chaos. "Now you have no choice but to let me." He reached for her. Margaret shoved Thomas behind her, raising the only weapon she had, Mary's diary. "She wrote it all down, Garrison. I know what you did." For a fraction of a second, his composure cracked. A flash of pure fury crossed his face. "A dead woman's lies," he spat, lunging for the book. The crack of a rifle from outside, impossibly loud, made him flinch. A bullet ripped through the doorframe inches from his head. Ethan, he was still fighting, still buying them time. The distraction was all Margaret needed. She feinted left, then shoved past Garrison on the right, pulling Thomas with her. They burst out into the yard into a war zone. Two of Garrison's men lay dead on the ground. Ethan was pinned down behind the water trough, returning fire with methodical precision, but he was bleeding from a wound on his shoulder. "Run!" Ethan roared, seeing them. "Get to the trees!" Margaret ran, half dragging, half carrying Thomas. The air was filled with the whine of bullets. One plucked at her sleeve. Another kicked up dirt at her feet. They were almost to the relative safety of the dark tree line when a searing pain exploded in her calf. Her leg buckled and she went down, crying out as she shielded Thomas with her body. She twisted to look at her leg. Blood was soaking through her dress. She could see the hole, dark and ugly. She tried to stand, but the leg wouldn't hold her. Garrison was walking toward them, a pistol in his hand, a triumphant sneer on his face. "It's over," he said. "He can't save you. No one can." From the barn, a sound rose above the battle, a furious, desperate scream of pure rage. It wasn't human. It was the sound of a heart breaking and a beast being born. The barn doors burst open. Ethan charged out, not on foot, but on horseback. He was riding his big war horse, bareback, a rifle in one hand, reins in the other. He wasn't a rancher anymore. He was an avenging angel, a fury of grief and vengeance. He rode directly into the fray, his horse rearing and striking, his rifle barking death. The hired guns, who had signed on to burn out a lone homesteader, had never planned on facing a mounted berserk warrior. They faltered. They broke. Some turned and ran for their horses, wanting no part of this madness. Ethan ignored them. His eyes were locked on one man, Garrison. Garrison raised his pistol, firing wildly at the charging horse, but his hands were shaking. He was no gunman. He was a bully who paid others to do his dirty work. Ethan rode him down. The horse slammed into Garrison, sending him flying. He landed in a heap, his pistol skittering away into the dirt. Ethan leaped from the horse's back before it even stopped moving. He stood over Garrison, his face a mask of cold fury, the rifle leveled at his chest. The few remaining gunmen saw their employer defeated and fled into the night. Silence fell, broken only by the crackle of the burning cabin and Thomas's terrified sobs. "You took her from me," Ethan said, his voice raw, hollow. "You burned my home. You hurt my family." Margaret, gripping her wounded leg, tried to call out to stop him. This wasn't justice. This was an execution. But no sound came out. Garrison, lying broken on the ground, laughed, a gurgling, bloody sound. "They'll hang you, Brooks. You kill me and they'll hang you, and she'll be all alone again." He coughed, spitting blood. "Just like she was when you found her." Ethan's finger tightened on the trigger. "No!" Margaret finally found her voice. "Ethan, don't! Don't become him!" Ethan looked from Garrison's broken form to Margaret, holding their son, her face pale with pain and fear. He looked at what was left of his home. He looked at the woman who had brought life back into his world, only for him to bring death to hers. He lowered the rifle. He turned his back on Garrison and walked to Margaret, his shoulders slumped. He knelt beside her, his expression devastated. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his hand hovering over her wound, as if afraid to touch her. "I brought this on you. You saved us," she said, her hand finding his. "We're alive because of you." Behind them there was a scrabbling sound. Garrison had crawled to his pistol. He raised it with a shaking hand, a final desperate act of vengeance. "Ethan, look out!" Margaret didn't know where the strength came from. She threw herself sideways, knocking Ethan off balance. Just as the pistol fired, the bullet, meant for Ethan's back, tore through the fleshy part of her arm. She cried out, a fresh wave of agony washing over her. The shot seemed to break a spell in the valley. From the darkness, hoofbeats sounded. Not the stealthy approach of killers, but the thunder of a dozen angry men. The other ranchers, Ben Cooper, Jack Morrison, and the rest. They had seen the fire from their own homesteads and had finally decided that one man's war had become their own. They rode into the yard to a scene of carnage, a burning cabin, a wounded woman and child, a bleeding rancher, and a defeated villain still trying to commit murder. Garrison saw them, saw the cold fury on their faces, and knew it was over. His reign of terror built on fear and division had ended. He had pushed one man too far, and in doing so, had united the very people he sought to control. Ben Cooper dismounted, his shotgun leveled. "It's over, Garrison." Garrison dropped the pistol, defeated, exposed, ruined. Ethan ignored them all. His world had shrunk to the woman bleeding in his arms. "Margaret," he choked out, pressing his hands to her new wound. "Stay with me. Please, stay with me." She looked up at him, her vision starting to blur at the edges. She saw his face, stripped of its grief and anger, leaving only a desperate, terrifying love. She saw her son, safe. She saw the community that had finally come to their aid. She clutched the diary to her chest. "The truth," she whispered. "Make them see the truth." And then the world went black. She woke to the smell of clean linen and antiseptic. Sunlight streamed through a glass window, not a shuttered opening. She was in a bed, a real bed, with soft sheets and a thick quilt. Her arm and leg were tightly bandaged, aching with a dull, persistent throb, but she was alive. Ethan was asleep in a chair beside the bed, his head slumped forward. His own shoulder was bandaged, and his face, in the unforgiving light of day, was etched with exhaustion and fear. He looked older, worn down to the bone. She reached out, her fingers brushing his hand. His eyes snapped open. The relief that flooded his face was so powerful, it was like watching the sun rise. "Margaret," he breathed, his voice hoarse. His hand enveloped hers, holding on as if she were an anchor in a storm. "Thomas?" was her first word. "He's safe," Ethan assured her quickly. "He's with the Coopers. Mrs. Cooper is spoiling him rotten. He's asking for you every 5 minutes." "Garrison?" "The territorial marshal came," Ethan said, a grim satisfaction in his voice. "He arrived 2 days earlier than expected. He saw the aftermath. He heard the testimony from all the other ranchers. And then," he gestured to the nightstand, "Mary's diary sat there." He read this, Ethan finished. He read it all. Garrison's been arrested. For the attack, for arson, and for the murder of Mary Brooks. The sheriff, his cousin, has been removed from his post. It's over. For good. The weight of it, the finality, was almost too much to comprehend. Justice. Real justice. It was a concept she had stopped believing in. Tears welled in her eyes. "I'm so sorry, Ethan," she whispered, her voice thick with shame. "I doubted you. I believed him, even for a moment." "Hush," he said, his thumb gently wiping a tear from her cheek. "He showed you proof. He lied, and he was convincing. I was silent. I gave you no reason to trust me. The fault is mine. I tried to wall off the past, and in doing so, I almost let it destroy our future." Our future. The words hung in the air, full of a hope she hadn't dared to feel. "There's not much of a future at the ranch," she said quietly, thinking of the burned-out cabin. "It's all gone." "No," he said, his gaze intense. "It's not. The lean-to survived. The barn is mostly intact, and the foundation of the cabin is still strong." He leaned closer, his eyes pleading with her to understand. "Margaret, for 3 years, that place was just a house, a shell full of ghosts. The night you arrived, it started to feel like a home again. A home is not wood and nails. It's people. It's us." He let go of her hand and reached into his pocket. He pulled out a simple gold ring. It was worn, elegant. "This was Mary's," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "When I lost her, I thought I'd lost the capacity to feel anything like this ever again. I was wrong. I was just waiting. I didn't know it, but I was waiting for you. You and Thomas. You walked out of the dust and brought my world back to life, and I almost got you killed." He shook his head, a look of self-reproach on his face. "I can't offer you a fancy house. I can't offer you an easy life. The ranch needs to be rebuilt. There will be hard work and long days. But I can offer you my whole heart, all of it. I can promise you that you will never be a servant. You will be a partner, a wife, my wife. I can promise you that I will spend every day of my life protecting you and Thomas and cherishing you." He held up the ring. "Margaret Sawyer, you came to me offering to be my slave. I'm asking you to be my salvation. Marry me." She looked at this quiet, broken man who had fought like a lion for her, a man who had faced down his past and conquered his demons to save her. She looked at the simple gold ring, a symbol not of a love that was lost, but of a love that was strong enough to make room for a new one. Through her tears, she smiled. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, 1,000 times yes." He slipped the ring onto her finger. It was a perfect fit. A few days later, they stood on the hill overlooking the ranch. The burned-out shell of the cabin was a scar on the land. But already the neighbors were there. Cooper, Morrison, and a half-dozen others were clearing the debris, preparing to help them rebuild. Thomas was in the middle of it all, supervising with the solemn importance of a 4-year-old. Ethan wrapped his arms around her from behind, his chin resting on her shoulder. Her bandages were fresh, his arm was in a sling, but they were whole. They were together. "Look at that," he said softly. "A home." She had walked onto this land with nothing but a dying child and a broken heart. She had offered her freedom for a piece of bread, and somehow in the heart of the wild, unforgiving prairie, she had found everything. A home, a family, A love forged in fire and sealed with a promise. The past would always be a part of their story, its scars a reminder of the battles they had won. But now, for the first time in a long, long time, the future looked as wide and full of promise as the Wyoming sky. Thank you for watching this story of survival, courage, and the incredible power of a mother's love. We were on the edge of our seats the whole time. How about you? If you enjoyed Margaret and Ethan's journey, do us a favor and hit that subscribe button. It really helps our channel grow and bring you more stories like this one. And we have to ask, what was the moment that shocked you the most? Was it the reveal of Mary's diary or Ethan's charge from the barn? Drop a comment below and let us know. We read every single one. Thanks for being part of our community, and we'll see you in the next story.